Okay, it looks like quite a few people have joined already, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, this is Pecan Street's second Race and Energy webinar in our series. And we're happy to have you all here today. I think to get started, we're going to hand it over to Pecan Street's CEO, Suzanne Russo.
Thank you, Clayton. Thanks everyone again for joining us for today's webinar. It's the second in our series on race and energy. We're very excited that you joined this conversation, and we hope that you'll submit questions as we go if you have any. Everybody that's joining us as an audience member is muted, and so to submit questions, please use the chat button that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address those questions as we go. In case you missed our first webinar in this series, just a brief recap, and you can also watch a recording of that webinar on Pecan Street's YouTube channel. This webinar will also be shared there on our YouTube channel later this week. So in the first webinar, we talked quite a bit with our panelists about the connections between race and the energy sector. We talked about how race does influence and impact equitability within energy, and that covers a broad range of topics from energy affordability to job access to opportunities to participate in new clean energy programs and markets. And as part of that conversation, we were able to speak with Dr. Diana Hernández, who joins us again today, about terminology and why the words that we use to frame conversations about equity are important. I frequently encounter 5 terms that tend to be used interchangeably when we're trying to talk about low-income communities and or communities of color. Those terms include disadvantaged communities, Black communities, brown communities, as well as low-income communities. Dr. Hernández helped us to understand a little bit about why it's important to be intentional with these terms, particularly when we're talking about creating new programs or trying to change the way that our organizations operate to achieve equitability as the outcome. And when we use these kinds of terms interchangeably and as synonyms, they mask really important information about community differences that are necessary to understand in order to move towards anti-racism. And in today's webinar, we wanted to take time to address a lot of the questions that we were not able to get to in our first one. And most of those questions, the ones that we received during the webinar and in follow-up, pointed to a need for more information on why it's important to look at equity within the energy sector through a race-specific lens, and how that conversation and approach is different from a general framing around income. And today, each of our panelists has graciously spent quite a bit of time pulling together their thoughts on that topic in order to help us better understand this distinction, and also to help us all think about how we can implement an anti-racist approach in our work. So at this point, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Diana Hernández, who's an associate professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Hernández, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you again, Suzanne. Really excited to be here again. And I don't have slides today. I'll be working from notes. You know, what we can recognize about the issue about race and energy is that it's a continuous conversation, and it's new enough that we have to kind of invest more upfront in order to better understand it. So I'm here today to continue the conversation about race and energy and really frame the problem as one along the energy continuum and also as a matter of justice. Listen, I know it's sometimes easier to talk about disadvantage from the perspective of socioeconomic status. A lot of our programs and our policies are geared toward low and moderate income populations. This way of framing the problem sometimes is used as code for communities of color. But we don't talk about race, and we certainly don't talk about it enough in terms of energy. And we could be worse. In the UK, where they've been talking about fuel poverty for at least 2 decades, they have mostly framed this as an issue of the elderly. And their policies have basically offered protections on the basis of age along the life course. So if you're an older person in the UK, you qualify for a subsidy regardless of your socioeconomic position, and certainly notwithstanding your racial or ethnic status. But in the US, we haven't had the luxury to talk about social injustices without also appreciating the ways in which they manifest along a color line. And so this is not about being ethnocentric, so that in the US we're better than, in this example, the UK, but it is to say that our unique history doesn't allow us to ignore the issue of race, even though it's sometimes convenient and feels better than to talk about it directly. And so as we kind of honor the legacy of the civil rights movement, for instance, then we have to appreciate that race is an important manifestation of injustice in the United States. And speaking of justice, we can talk about energy justice, which is really anchored by 4 pillars. And those pillars are recognition, distributional justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice. And essentially, to kind of think about what those mean, procedural justice is really about self-governance, inclusion, interactive participation. Distributive justice is about the allocation of the benefits and burdens. And recognition justice is about respect and diversity. And restorative justice is about making right what has been wrong, especially in this distribution of benefits and burdens. As I like to think about it, recognition is the first step to justice. We can't achieve procedural, distributional justice, and certainly not restorative justice, without fully appreciating which populations have been most impacted by injustice and how those injustices manifest. So, where we see this as relevant is really across the energy continuum, thinking about supply and demand dynamics and the distributional procedures that are involved in energy. On the supply side, it's where energy is produced. On the demand side, it's where energy is consumed. And on the distributional side, it's where oil, for instance, is refined. And for the most part, in terms of thinking about oil refineries as an example, what we see, or where energy is produced, for instance, what we see is that in some communities, they have a choice between poverty and pollution. And what I have recognized is that is a privilege in even having the choice between poverty and pollution. Because if you're a Black person in the United States living in a community where there are others that are also Black and poor, then you probably don't have that choice. And those two things coexist, that of poverty and pollution, and where energy may be an important source for that pollution. We also know that on the demand side, as we kind of discussed in the last webinar, that there are many, many families in the United States disproportionately represented by African Americans and other people of color, namely Latinos and indigenous populations, that on a regular basis cannot afford their energy. And if you're an African American head of household that's low income, living in a poorly insulated home, you have between 25 and 59% chance of being disconnected in your utility services. All of that reflecting the additional burdens associated with the demand side, or the energy insecurity aspects of the energy continuum. Now, I'd like to also kind of talk about other stories that I've understood nationally. The story in Alabama, for instance, about racial disenfranchisement on boards in rural electric co-ops, where the constituency base is primarily African American, but the boards are disproportionately white. The homes where Black people live, for instance, in Detroit and in Memphis, where they're owners, but they're the least efficient and have suffered the long-term disinvestment and being locked out of mainstream financial systems that have allowed them to improve, for instance, the housing quality. And that has implications not just for the energy efficiency as it stands, but also for introducing new energy technologies that are really based on having a sound housing structure. There's also employment in the energy sector, and who gets to benefit from existing energy jobs and the green energy jobs of the future, because there's trust and there's investment in certain populations that they're capable of participating as actors in the green energy economy. But that's not necessarily a trust that is extended and an investment that is extended across the across racial lines. I talked about the energy burden and disconnection pieces, and also the oil refineries and coal power plants that are most likely to be sited in Black and brown communities, where they also suffer the corresponding adverse health consequences, such as asthma, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and reproductive outcomes, such as in Philadelphia. There was a recent New York Times article that kind of described this whole issue of pollution in a Philadelphia community. There's also the delayed participation in the clean energy economy, such as solar penetration due to housing tenure status, so whether or not people are renters or owners, and the housing conditions and the lack of financial capacity to participate due to existing wealth gaps. Now, if you'll allow me, I want to get personal, because I guess I can't deny the fact that I'm a woman of color. I am Puerto Rican by heritage. I grew up and actually still live in the South Bronx. And anybody that knows about the South Bronx probably understands it to be a community that is essentially kind of has a legacy of burden on many levels, but the environmental burdens have been manifold and have been ongoing. In my community, we have exposures to multiple environmental burdens, from an existing power plant and substation to like this time, it's the cooling season, and compared to most of the city, only 70% of households in the Bronx actually have an air conditioner, in comparison to almost 100% of residents in Manhattan. There are no heat complaints in the Bronx. There are many more housing condition issues in the Bronx. And the Bronx also happens to be a place that is primarily people of color, Latinx, and Blacks. And that has always been the composition of this community. And while it is poor and has existed in poverty and a very concentrated form of poverty, the environmental insults that have burdened my community have also made me emotional, but they've also materialized into very poor health outcomes for my neighbors and for my family members. And so I, as a person of color, and as someone who is in the energy space, feel really strongly about the fact that this is a moment for us to act. It is a moment for us to start to honestly recognize and reckon with the challenges of racial inequity when it comes to energy as an isolated issue, but also as energy intersects with other issues that we can't ignore, like that of housing quality, like that of housing affordability, like that of competing expenses that families have, such as food and medicine, and where those trade-offs are often happening. And so as I think about what are the real calls for racial justice and energy, I have three particular guiding points, or asks really. And they're firstly to do your own personal work. Just like I got emotional and had to come from a personal place about why race and energy intersect as I understand it in my own community and in my own life, I ask you to really ask yourself, why is it sometimes difficult to pinpoint race as an important metric and target in your own work as a policymaker, as a practitioner, as someone that is in this space? Racism doesn't exist without racists, but colorblind racism has allowed us to not situate our own selves and our own realities in the spectrum and in the reality of racism and its insidious nature in our society. And so for that, we really do have to step into our personal selves and really understand where we are and what are our own kind of buttons that feel uncomfortable to press when it comes to race. We also have to consider how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are unduly burdened by energy issues along the energy continuum, and ask ourselves in our work, does my company operation, this policy plan that I am designing, somehow unduly burden people of color? Is part of why I am requesting this rate increase, for instance, really about the profits for people that are not people of color, that haven't benefited from long-term investments in their own human capital, allowing them to also benefit from wealth? What communities will not be successful in resisting new projects, or knowing well that the project that is being designed will unlikely benefit people of color in large measure? We have to ask that of our roles in the organizations that we represent. The first part is asking that of ourselves. The second part is asking it of our roles. And the third part is about being intentional about diversity, inclusion, and equity in our organizations. What's the makeup? And how is diversity, inclusion, and equity a part of the mission and vision of the organization? Who's represented and who's missing? Those are important pieces to ask. And it's not enough and it's not okay to continue to say that we don't have talented and qualified people of color to fill those roles. And if that is the case, then I charge you with basically building the pipeline so that it's not the case in 5 to 10 years. So we have to think about the short term and the long term, but we must engage. We don't have a choice. If we're committed to energy justice and justice in its many forms, then we have got to address the issue of race head on. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I think you made all of us cry. I'm gonna just roll straight into John Hall's comments. I think you probably set him up really well for a variety of things I know he wants to talk about. Thanks, John. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you again. It's always important, I believe, to begin with one basic fact. And that is that in U.S. in this country, race has been, and race unfortunately still is, the most dominant issue in our politics, and is a key factor, if not the most important factor, in terms of economic benefits or the economic well-being of different persons and communities, educational attainment, the quality of housing that they may live in, the schools they may attend. With regard to all of the issues that a person of color or an African American may encounter, energy is perhaps one of the most dominant. You know, when we get up in the morning time and we go into our bathrooms and get started for the day, we're using energy, electricity in particular, generated all too often by dirty coal plants, natural gas fired power plants that may emit less pollution, both climate and air pollution, than coal plants, but nevertheless emit significant levels of pollutants that affect human health. And then most of us, as we leave home for our job, before COVID, we would go to our cars, drive to work, utilizing gasoline or diesel in the vehicles that took us to work. So all of us, regardless to our ethnicity or income, we have to deal with energy issues every day. And the George Floyd murder was the catalyst for these discussions that we're having. And I think all of us have been encouraged about the outpouring of concern and even positive action that has been undertaken since. In preparing for my remarks today, I did some internet research just to get a feel for what different kinds of companies, how they have responded since that unfortunate incident. It's amazing at the outpouring and the positive responses that have come from businesses. All of us are familiar with what's happening in the sports world: NASCAR, the NBA, the NFL, the NBL. But in addition to those, financial institutions, retail companies, beverage and food companies, banks, and the high-tech industry. Many of the companies engaged in those businesses have come forward and made significant commitments to promote racial justice and equality. In my research, I couldn't find one energy company, either on the electric generation side in terms of fossil fuel being used to generate electricity, or in terms of oil and gas companies. I couldn't find one that had come forward and made a positive commitment to engage in a concrete way on these issues, or engage at all. And I think that's telling, because I think if you talk to African Americans who are in the workforce, it is they will tell you that it is very difficult to find employment in the energy sector, which has some of the best paying jobs, the best benefits of any set of companies in the US. And then if you were to do research as to where these facilities are located, as Diana indicated, oftentimes, in fact, perhaps more frequently than not, these facilities are located in communities that are both low income and primarily African Americans. And one of the things that has changed is that before all of the mechanization occurred, before consolidations occurred, a lot of the unskilled jobs 30 years ago in the energy sector were filled by persons of color. In many instances, that's no longer the case. So communities of color, African-American communities, especially in Texas, have to deal with an interesting phenomenon. Oftentimes, many live in neighborhoods closest to these facilities and must bear the brunt of the pollution that is emitted. Additionally, these residents today do not benefit in large part from the significant economic benefits the energy sector can provide and does provide. So as we begin to reflect and think about what we can do as we move forward, it is probably the case that we have more work to be done in the energy sector than any other. And that in and of itself is challenging. But based on the responses that we've seen from different sectors of the economy since George Floyd, the early evidence suggests that while energy may have more impact on our lives than most sectors, I believe that progress in that sector, in terms of diversity of the workforce, in terms of companies stepping forward to proactively address the emissions, the environmental issues that result from their operations, I am concerned that we won't see prompt action. In fact, we may not see action unless the federal government steps up and require it. And in Texas, we're blessed in terms of employment and in terms of our economy to claim a lot of the energy jobs in the US, in this country. But for a large part of the state's population, who may be African American and increasingly Latino, those communities, those persons are challenged every day by the pollution and the environmental conditions or the environmental challenges that result from the operation of those companies or their facilities, and also have not been incorporated into their workforces to reach a level of equal employment that we could be proud of. Our energy sector is important, but when it comes to race and equality of opportunity for everyone, the biggest challenges we may face may be in this sector that affect each and every one of our lives every day. I'll stop there and look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you, John. Thank you for doing that research today as well, looking at how energy companies specifically have responded to everything that's happening in our countries with Black Lives Matter, more documentation of systemic racism. I'm really shocked. Also brought to tears by learning from you that no energy companies have made any statements or public commitments to address racism. And one of the things I would love to talk about with the whole panel, after we hear from Dana and Fisayo, are your recommendations for how we can help our sector get started. And Dr. Hernández provided really brilliant framing of both of how to undertake analysis within the energy sector specifically on where we have racism and where we can see its impacts. And once we have that acknowledgement, then we can start to create programs that undo that racism and seek justice. But John, it also seems like perhaps the energy sector, or at least the large companies, might be lacking the will to do that, to engage in any of that work. So I'd love to talk about how we can help change that in just a couple of minutes. But I do want to make sure we have a chance to hear from all of our panelists. So John, thank you so much for your time and your wealth of knowledge and your research. I'm going to turn it over to Dana Harmon at this point, Executive Director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Initiative. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you for having me again for this incredibly important discussion. And thank you, Diana and John, for both your wealth of knowledge and your vulnerability, which I think sets such a strong example for all of us. You know, talking about race is hard, but it's absolutely necessary for so many of the reasons that John and Diana shared. And thank you again to Pecan Street for hosting such a brave and bold conversation. And we have to have conversations like this so that we can move forward together to dismantle systemic racism. You know, personally, I felt a whole range of emotions, including certainly on this panel so far, in my own journey about energy, exploring energy and race, but more importantly, how race plays out in my everyday life. And over the past weeks, you know, preparing for conversations with my staff, with my colleagues, and my friends and my family, including my 2 young daughters, as well as, you know, of course, this conversation in the last one, I've thought to myself many times, you know, what business does this white woman have getting up here and having this discussion? And, you know, who am I to claim to have any answers on how to address issues around race and energy? You know, I think about the white privilege that I, whether knowingly or not, have has really affected the trajectory of my entire life in ways small and very large. And I also think about what implicit biases, you know, have I held and might I still hold? And do I, as Diana mentioned, do I appreciate and acknowledge the history of individual, institutional, and structural racism that's led to so many aspects of our society? And, you know, I've put a lot of thought into this topic, and, you know, I think that the answer to what business do I have is that I'm human. And, you know, in fact, I think scientists agree that race doesn't exist biologically or genetically, but it is this social construct, and racial identity is so powerful, and it shapes so many interactions that we have with one another. And as I'm reflecting back on this year that has been 2020 so far, you know, I personally believe that there's been no louder call to action in my lifetime than the exposure of and the call to address huge disparities in our social systems. And, you know, we, as part of our social contracts with one another, cannot stand for the great disparities that exist in wealth and access to resources and opportunities for people in our communities. And time again, as both Diana and John have pointed out, when we look at which communities are most vulnerable, you know, including in this pandemic, who is bearing the largest health tolls, who's facing job loss, who's at the highest risk of eviction, people of color are suffering at significantly higher rates than white people. And, you know, this is not unique to our current health pandemic and economic crisis. The research that we covered in our last webinar coming out of Berkeley showed that Black households have higher residential energy expenditures than white households in the US. And that exists after controlling for income, household size, home ownership status in the city of residence. And I think that's why it's important, as Diana set us up so eloquently, to not only have a conversation about income, but also let's focus on racial equity and energy. There's a powerful quote that I read recently from the UN Assistant Attorney General, and she said, that a new social contract needs to emerge from this crisis that rebalances the deep inequalities that are prevalent across our societies, and importantly, including in energy. The Government Alliance for Racial Equity says that the achievement of racial equity is when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved. The energy sector will be paramount in reaching that goal. We know that race and energy poverty are inextricably linked. We know that African Americans, Latinos, and indigenous communities suffer disproportionately from energy poverty. However, as this panel is showing, racial equity in energy is related to energy poverty, but it's an importantly different objective, and we need to be able to have this nuanced conversation about what that means. Significant racial disparities exist, and as we've discussed, in access to clean energy, weatherization, energy efficiency, and quality of housing, exposure to environmental consequences, and importantly, as has been discussed, participation in the energy economy, including the full workforce, but especially in executive leadership and decision-making. So I fundamentally believe that it's the responsibility of each of us to not just talk about why this conversation is so important, but to also talk about what we each might do about it from whatever role that is that we're playing in the world. As Diana said, I love the quote that we each have to do our own personal work when it comes to this topic. So, I think with whatever sense of agency I have, I wanted to think about what that may mean for me and my organization and the mission that I serve. And so I should say that these views are my own and don't necessarily represent the views of my board or my members, but I wanted to share a few things that I've been thinking about how TEPRI's work might change if we were to focus more on racial equity in energy and not just on energy poverty. So as a research institution, we work to provide research and analysis and thought leadership to people who can make decisions to address energy poverty or reduce energy cost burdens. And it's true that our work has largely focused on solutions for underserved communities based on some measure of their incomes. We segment our analysis a lot based on comparisons to the federal poverty line, or we conduct research on energy cost burdens and energy-related trade-offs experienced by low-income people. But we really haven't focused on racial equity in energy enough. And I think just as we're raising awareness and working with key stakeholders in utilities, with affordable housing providers, with policymakers on issues of energy poverty, we should also be using that same platform to raise awareness and working with those stakeholders on issues of energy equity, racial energy equity, including specifically addressing disparities that we know exist. I also wanted to think a little bit about where this research and our work should be headed and what data might we need that we don't yet have. And I've thought a lot about this question, and part of what I really want to put some thought and energy into is we described earlier in the conversation that energy poverty and race are inextricably linked. But I'd like to say that that's until we do something about it. So what would it take to build a system where race was no longer a predictor of energy poverty? What would that look like? And how can we make sure that we develop systems that are inclusive and solution sets that work towards that outcome so that we can separate race and energy poverty? I also wanted to think about how can I set practices in place within my organization to make sure that my team and collaboratively with my board of directors, that we are more diverse, inclusive, and include representation of the communities that we serve. We should strive for diversity and inclusion in our work, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes us better. It makes us stronger. Bringing in perspectives that are different than our own strengthen our ability to understand and respond to what's happening in the world, and frankly, put us in better positions to develop solutions that have a greater impact and outcomes in our work, whatever that work may be. I think the reality is, Diana mentioned this earlier as well, but yes, our work around energy poverty does require a fairly specific and technical skill set. And the reality is that when I post for a position, especially a higher level position, the majority of the applications that we receive are from white candidates. But that doesn't mean that that's okay and we just continue with the system that exists. I think what that means is that we need to think about diversifying our channels of recruiting. We need to think about developing stronger relationships with historically Black colleges, with the NAACP, with the Association of Blacks in Energy. We need to create leadership development pipelines and pathways that intentionally recruit and serve Black and Brown people and make investments in leadership. Just like the investments that I feel like I've been fortunate to have received in my career. This isn't easy work, and these aren't conversations they're easy to have. And we're certainly not going to get it all right, but I think it's very important that we have this discussion openly and honestly with one another about how we might work together to address these issues. I do believe that we all have our part to play. And again, to quote Diana, I think that this is very deeply personal work as well. So in conclusion, I believe that TEPRI's work to address energy poverty specifically is more important than ever. And I am concerned about the economic fallout as a result of our current pandemic and the disproportionate impacts and effects on Black and Brown communities. And as we work to address energy poverty, I think that this is an opportunity to rebuild a system that must actively work towards advancing energy equity, which also means a system in which race is no longer a predictor of energy poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Fisayo, let's move straight to you, and then if we have time, we'll get to a couple of questions. There's great questions coming in from our audience today. Thank you all again for joining us for this webinar. If we don't get directly to your questions today, we'll try to follow up with you. Fisayo, we can hear you, but not, we can see you, but not hear you yet.
I'm having internet connections. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, yeah, I apologize for that. My internet connection is not that great here. But thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to the other, my co-panelists as well. My contribution to this important topic is from the perspective of community leadership and social citizenship. So we talk about, why does race matter? What is distinct about race, and what does undoing racism in energy with the power of local government look like? I'm a first-generation immigrant from Nigeria, and what I have discovered, what is unique about racial injustice in America is that as a person of color, you cannot out-earn, or you can hardly out-earn or outperform or out-achieve the adverse consequences of adverse occurrences of racial bias. You cannot by yourself, or hardly by yourself, be insulated from the damaging stereotypes. And frankly, it's hard for one to be immune from the psychological attacks. Racism is institutional. And the reason why race must be specifically named and addressed is the fact that several systems in our society are so structurally discriminatory, as the other panelists have talked about. Unlike our white counterparts, the barriers are stacked against people of color such that, on the average, the same amount of will, of determination, of effort, and self-agency does not comparatively yield the same level of advancement. And so if we have all, as a community, we have these good intentions, if the community aim is to achieve real equality, we cannot just look at symptoms like poverty or energy burdens, which may tempt us to believe that we can innovatively, easily fix things by providing, occasional financial incentives. We need to get to the root causes of inequality. We need to talk about and confront the reality of ongoing systemic neglect, of exclusion, and entrenched institutional biases across industries that continue to put people of color perpetually in a lagging state. In the community, it's the fact that in most urban areas, race and place are inextricably intertwined. The Black and brown side of town was intentionally designated to Black and brown people and designed by policy and by ongoing accepted norms of neglect to be deficient, to be the part that is poorly served, to be inferior. This is the reality and this is the custom in parts, for instance, of East Austin, where it is the norm to have failing infrastructure, to have wires hanging out of power lines, to have trash left uncollected, to have, poor utility services, just a general sense of neglect and unaccountability of city leadership. We know that customs cannot be altered indirectly. And so the issues that are rooted in racial discrimination have to be addressed intentionally. We have to intentionally cultivate change. In other sectors, it is also the fact that biases make exclusion of people of color more rampant. They're subject to more stringent standards of performance, of decorum, of lower compensation for similar qualifications and work, slower career advancement, more difficulty or impossibility, for instance, in the tech world, to accessing capital that allows for substantial wealth creation. And the list goes on. And what I'm not saying that progress is not being made. It's just that on the average, we are a long way away from equality and we need to call that out. The challenge is that some of the discriminatory beliefs and biases and attitudes that were previously overtly expressed and acceptable in the past are still present, even if not overt. And so to me, what this all means is that to undo racism and move towards equity, I, my white friends, members, and leaders of the community must be willing to have the uncomfortable discussions about race and specifically target biases, not just proxies in our corrective policy making. I think that the cost of silence on specifically calling out race while attempting to use proxies like low income to solve problems that are in fact rooted in institutional racism is pent up tension and frustration because the core of the problem is not acknowledged or it is sidestepped. And so we miss the target. And so what can I do as I think through it, what can I do in my world as a voice for the community and to city leadership? I think that I can play a more active role in calling for city leadership by example, not just talk, but action. I can get off the sidelines and participate in working groups that call for and help articulate what commitment to measurable goals and target on undoing racial inequality looks like. I can be a part of calling for more accountability around increasing representation of people of color, and not just the facial counts, but representation that matters, representation that is backed by decision-making power. I can be more active in calling for thorough evaluation and audits of the city's systems of services. I can not go with neglect, and I can be more proactive in calling for audits of these systems and processes, particularly looking for the manifestation of institutional racism, and be persistent in pressing for corrective actions. And when there's the call to show up, I can make sure to show up and align with the city, call for the city to promote avenues for community dialogue on issues of race and biases. We all have blind spots. But I think when there's community dialogue on these issues, we can help educate one another on the whole and uncover our blind spots. And finally, I think that cities play a big role in the way that their core industries, including energy, operate. For example, they provide incentives that provide, they provide incentives and initiatives that they provide requirements, or they mandate requirements for certain initiatives. And so in the area of energy or clean energy, I think about Austin. When a company like Tesla vies for a place in our community, people like me should be more proactive in the public discussion and commentary, specifically pushing for negotiation terms that include commitments to provide for both line and leadership role job opportunities for people of color. I think that if undoing racism in the energy sector and other sectors is important, it cannot be an afterthought. It always has to be at the forefront. And city leadership, with the push from community representatives and people like me who try to be active in the community, can help make this an ongoing priority. And those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Fisayo. As always, very articulate and really useful framing of the conversation as well. We just have a little bit under 10 minutes left, and we got a great question from an audience member that I think would be wonderful to start off with. The question is, given that systemic racism is intrinsically linked to capitalism, how can we ensure that our approach to energy transformation is equitable? In other words, given the dominance of whiteness in the energy sector, how do we offset the potential for new solutions? I'm going to frame it specifically in terms of the transition to clean energy, to simply perpetuate in a new form systemic racism and the same kinds of programs and governance structures that we have now within the energy sector. John, you've spoken about this a little bit in the past. Maybe you would like to start off for us.
Could you restate your question again to make it clear, please?
Yeah, sure. So focusing on the transition to clean energy, how can we make sure that as we have this transformation occur related to climate within the energy sector, it's not just a replacement of fuel source, but it also is transitioning to a better sector that undoes racism at the same time?
First of all, I think the transition to clean energy is very important because of the jobs that they provide Texans, and those resources simultaneously reduce or eliminate both air pollution and climate pollution. I spent a great deal of my time working to promote their products. I applaud them for what they're doing. However, when it comes to being proactive in terms of engaging with African-American communities and other communities of color, I think that's lacking. I think there is an incredible opportunity business-wise for those companies to focus on Texas' very large minority community, because collectively African Americans and Latinos purchasing power is hundreds of billions of dollars. And I'll share a quick story. When climate legislation was introduced 8 years ago, the Congressional Black Caucus members supported climate legislation more than any other group of legislators. All voted for the climate bill. There's not another constituency or another group of congressmen who lent that level of support to that legislation. And so in order to address climate change, we obviously have to move to a clean energy economy. And thus far, I don't see that industry. I see it being very aggressive in making sure that its share of the energy market grows, which is a good thing. And I know they're very busy, but I think it's that to date, I have not seen them take deliberate and proactive actions to make sure that when it comes to diversity of their workforce, with regard to working, for example, with mayors to grow distributive energy resources as an economic development strategy. I haven't seen them be proactive on those issues. I think one of the assignments I've given myself is, since I work on that industry every day, I'm going to take time to reach out to them, challenge them, because in fact, the more, if they could actually place as much emphasis on extending clean energy to communities of color in this state, they make a hell of a lot more money. And so they have an economic self-interest to do what they're currently not doing. And unless they are proactive, soon they will find themselves in the same position that we often criticize the fossil fuel companies for. And that is, they're very much a part of our economy. They're providing great jobs, but communities of color, African Americans in particular, are not participating in the benefits that they provide in terms of jobs and income. Big challenge. I think we can overcome it, but it's going to take work and commitment to get there.
Sorry, John, I love that I love so many things about you, but I love that you're working on helping companies understand the economic incentive as well to the question that we had addressed, understand the economic business case to undo racism and increase diversity. Dr. Hernández, at the beginning of the webinar, again, you gave that wonderful several framing principles that we could use to think about how we address and undo racism within the energy sector. I love so much how you broke it down to looking at where we generate energy, where we consume energy, and then the distribution, and starting with ourselves doing the work and then looking at our roles within our organizations. Any other comments or thoughts you could share on how we can move companies, whether we work at those companies or not, to really be strategic and effective in undoing racism, improving diversity and equitability as an outcome of their business?
I think that, just like recognition is the first step to justice in all of its manifestations, and, starting at a really local point is part of how we have to start these conversations. And believe me, right now, like, organizations across multiple sectors are trying to figure out how to become anti-racist. And I think if we appreciate the fact that this is a charge that has come as a result of action that has asked us to question a sentiment before we actually introduce policy, then it is about an introspective process that makes us all kind of understand where we start, like our own starting places, and then how our work kind of perpetuates a certain reality and where we think those intervention opportunities are to say we don't have to do business as usual. It's kind of like what John was saying. Clean energy will be fossil fuel in its, in its exploitation and or its kind of ill representation of, people of color, for instance, unless it starts out in a place where it's asking those questions. And so, I think that part of the work is, it's like in concentric circles. And what we can control is what we understand to be our own roles. And I think Dana and Fisayo both did a really great job of situating themselves in this work and also seeing and making personal commitments. And those are important places. And I think the other part of it is then to say, okay, and in the place where I am, what kinds of changes can I make beyond myself? What demands and what commitments will I make and will I insist upon for others to essentially follow? And I think that those are, places to start. I don't know that we will figure this out immediately. Undoing a legacy of racism in a in a country where its historical context is so deeply connected to racial exploitation and difference is about the work, and it takes time, but we have to start somewhere. We can't necessarily, I think we aim really high, but we start somewhere that's feasible and then kind of make progressive changes. But I think we have to also be realistic about the fact that saying this has got to, we have got to make, this is it, this is the line, and it's no longer acceptable. And I think until the organizations say that, the utility companies, for instance, own the fact that they have to make statements about these things, etc. All of those things are part of it. It's about making that initial commitment and then moving forward with the work.
Thank you. I know we're a couple minutes over. We're going to go a few more minutes over. I hope that the audience will stick with us because this is important. But what I'd like to close with is something that I've heard quite a bit lately, is we don't want to be distracted from our effort on helping low-income customers in whatever segment of the energy industry that group might be in. We don't want to be distracted from helping our low-income customers by the conversation of the moment around race. And I think a lot of people are really missing the continuity of this is just the latest manifestation of the civil rights movement, of the pursuit of justice for Black people and people of color, but particularly Black people in our country. That's been going on for almost 300 years now. So I'd love any closing thoughts that the four of you could provide to counter when somebody hears that argument, that I don't want to be distracted from my focus on helping our low-income customers by this conversation of the moment, which I'll just say, I think, again, is a misunderstanding of the connection and the difference between socioeconomic status and race, and why it's important to do both, to look at both. Fisayo, you ready?
Yes, I guess my thought on that would be that I don't see how, if we are being honest, that if we're being honest, I think that focusing on the socioeconomic without the race, you're subconsciously neglecting a part of the problem. And so if we're being honest that we are trying to address the problem as a whole, you cannot, if you open up the blinders, you see race, and race is part of that conversation. And race is an aggravating factor as well. And so it is an incomplete discussion if the focus is only on socioeconomic without race. And so I don't think it's an intellectually honest conversation. It's not either or. I don't think it is either or, because they're linked. And you're leaving out the root again of some of these problems. You would be only scratching the surface if you focused on the socioeconomic and neglected the race. And also, I think in terms of resource allocation, I think if you're not looking at the entire picture, you could be throwing resources at a problem and still not seeing results because you're missing a big part of the problem, which is the root core. That race is a big part of the discussion and needs to be.
Thank you. John?
Well, I was looking at my friend Ben Harmon as you posed the question, because frankly, if you're talking about energy poverty, you're largely talking about African Americans and Latinos. That's the reality. So in our world, discussing race is challenging. It's difficult for us. So sometimes to make it easy for ourselves, we talk about lower income, persons of poverty. They're one and the same, because discrimination manifests itself in many different ways. And economics and income are a primary set of variables that racism and discrimination affect negatively. So there is great overlap between that group of people, that large group of people in Texas, which is approximately 4 million, and persons who happen to be African American, Latina, other persons from community of color. So I look forward to working with Dana and her team because it's a way for me to also be engaged in addressing economic challenges that African Americans, Latinos, and other persons who have substantial economic needs and are in that position in large part because of their ethnicity.
Thank you, John. Dana?
If I may, I know we're over, but I agree wholeheartedly with both what John and Fisayo have just said. And Fisayo, I loved your framing of if we are being intellectually honest about the root causes of energy poverty, we must acknowledge systemic racism and its causes, its effects throughout our system. And I keep going back, in fact, to Dr. Hernández's framing for us at the beginning of the discussion about recognition justice and recognizing we must recognize the root causes and the drivers of energy poverty if we have any hope of addressing those issues. And I think the framing for recognition justice, procedural justice, distributional justice, looking at who is bearing the costs and the benefits and the burdens of our system, and then finally restorative justice, I think are incredibly important concepts. And without this complete view, I do believe that we will be ineffective in our attempts to address issues around energy poverty. So this must be part of the conversation going forward.
Thanks, Dana. And Dr. Hernández, to me, when I hear that point about I don't want to be distracted from helping my low-income customers by being distracted with the conversation around race, the conversation of the moment, it also implies that the only conversation to be had around race and energy is related to poverty. And I wonder if you might speak to that and any other closing remarks that you want to make.
Such a great question. I just want to say that, there are other fields, and in the social sciences, for instance, and even critical race theory, they've talked about intersectionality for a very long time, meaning that, it's not necessarily that one is one thing only, right? And so as we are contending with issues of race, or in this case, low-income customers, it's also to appreciate that they have intersectional identities. And that in fact, it's race, it's gender, it's socioeconomic position that all, kind of render women of color the most disadvantaged across the life course, meaning that you have women with children and older adults, many of them women, but because of the whole gender issue in terms of earnings, it adds a whole nother layer. And that might be a more comfortable one, right? So if we say, gender inequalities in income render women, kind of poorer, and so they are the low-income customers, then we have to question why we might be more comfortable with gender and not, again, talking about it in terms of race. So there is some, kind of area of development in terms of appreciating that we're not just one thing oftentimes, that we are kind of layered in our privileges and our disadvantages. And I think to your point around, always associating race and energy as a question of Blackness and disadvantage, and not whiteness and privilege and wealth and access to, boards in terms of, I use the example of the rural electric co-ops, but even corporate board structures, like nonprofit board structures, like all of these things, right? What are we talking about in terms of leadership? Whose leadership do we trust? And who deserves to be wealthy when it comes to race? I mean, when it comes to energy, right? Like the question about that was posed earlier about clean energy, part of that, part of how we, I think, challenge the current capitalistic structure is by reimagining what a locally owned and distributed and managed, and like that's why I think rural electric co-ops are really like in some ways kind of a hopeful idea about what the energy future could look like, except that in its form, like in its current iterations in the South, it's like, oh, I don't know if I should be saying that, but that's how it makes me feel, that, like there are these kind of racial gaps in terms of who's represented on the boards and things like that. But in terms of like the local ownership, the idea that you have member owners, all of like, that it is a cooperative structure in its very essence, to me should be like the future of energy, and it should be the future of clean energy. That it's not just about some honchos, like, sitting and like, earning millions and billions of dollars on the backs of folks that can't afford it. And so that also then raises the questions about rates in a way that rural electric co-ops allow, that, there is this idea of, what suits the member owners, in a way that, we can't really question in the IOU structure. It's that you just owe, like, if you're poor and, you don't have the means, you're either in arrearage and you have some protections, or you don't and you're shut off, and all of the kind of spiraling effects from that flow from that. So to me, the energy future is one that is local, is one that's determined by in mass, in a more democratic process. And it's also one that is representative of the communities that are essentially using, but also kind of commanding of energy resources. So it's more inclusive, and it doesn't separate essentially the users from the owners. It doesn't have this kind of Marxist, like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie element that currently is very much at play in the energy sphere. And I think with that, I'm just gonna stop, but thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you all so much. Thank you for staying late. Dana Harmon, Dr. Diana Hernandez, John Hall, I know Fisayo Fadelu is back. I appreciate you all so much. I love this time with you, and thank you. And to all of our audience members, thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to email us any additional questions to media@pecanstreet.org. Thank you, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.